The night began with laughter, the kind that hides tension underneath. You could almost smell the nerves mixed with the aroma of aged Bordeaux and roasted rosemary chicken. Jack had planned this dinner for weeks, a small celebration after winning the biggest case of his career. 6 months of relentless work, weekends swallowed by paperwork, and now, finally, he could exhale. His house, the one he'd spent years restoring, looked warm, golden, alive again. But at the far end of the table sat Leo. Leo, Anna's ride or die, her best friend since college, the so-called artist who thought responsibility was a trap. His hair too long, his grin too sure, his opinions loud enough to fill the silence that good manners should have kept sacred. He was the static in every room, the ghost that never paid rent but still haunted the house. The others knew who he was. They'd seen him before, orbiting Anna like a moth around a flame that wasn't his. They exchanged tight smiles and cautious glances, silently praying that tonight wouldn't turn into a show. For a while, it didn't. The table clinked with toasts, laughter, fragments of stories. Jack let himself believe, just for a moment, that peace could exist between men like him and men like Leo. He had earned this calm. But Leo, predictably, mistook generosity for weakness. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine like a critic with no gallery, and began talking about art, the difference between creators and suits. He spoke like a prophet in a linen shirt, eyes fixed on Jack. "It's just a different way of seeing the world," he said. "Some of us are driven by passion, others by practicality." The room stiffened. Even the music seemed to falter, like it didn't want to be associated with the noise. Jack gave a polite smile, the kind lawyers wear when a witness lies on the stand. He didn't rise to the bait, he didn't need to. But Leo wasn't done. Men like him never are. He turned to Anna, voice dripping with feigned sincerity. "I just hope you're happy, Anna. Jack's a great guy, stable, reliable." He said reliable the way some people say boring. Then came the smirk, the slow, deliberate twist of a knife. "But you've got to admit she could do way better than you." The laughter stopped. The air thickened. Every eye turned to Jack. This was it, the rope. The one Leo had been weaving with his arrogance for years. Jack didn't shout. He didn't throw a punch. He simply set his fork down, folded his hands, and looked across the table with the calm precision of a man who spent his life dissecting lies for a living. "That's a bold claim, Leo," he said, voice low. "I'm interested in your reasoning. What does a better man for Anna look like? Please, be specific." Leo blinked. The performance script he'd written in his head suddenly blank. Well, you know, someone who gets her. Someone creative," Jack nodded slowly. "Creative, right. And you see yourself as fitting that description?" "Of course," Leo said, puffing out his chest. "Perfect," Jack replied, leaning back slightly. "Let's examine that." The table was silent now, the air electric, like a storm gathering just outside. Jack began, not as a man defending himself, but as a prosecutor calling out a fraud. "As everyone here knows, Anna's in her second year of law school. A top-tier program, not cheap. I'm paying for that because I believe in her future. That's my investment. Time, money, faith. Now tell me, Leo, what have you invested in her future lately, other than your consistently negative opinions of me?" Leo froze. Anna's eyes widened. "Jack, stop!" But Jack wasn't done. His voice grew quieter, sharper. "Let's talk about that car she drives. Safe, reliable, I bought it for her. You, on the other hand, drive a convertible that barely runs. She's had to loan you money for repairs, hasn't she? Money from the household account, which I fund entirely. So, in a sense, Leo, I'm not just investing in Anna's education. I'm also funding your transportation." Someone at the table stifled a laugh. Jack's tone stayed measured, surgical. "And finally, this house, the roof over her head. I pay for it. I fix what breaks. You, Leo, can't even pay rent on time. So when you say Anna could do better, what you really mean is she could do worse, with a man who drains her financially and manipulates her emotionally. Tell me, is that your definition of better?" Leo's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The silence was absolute. The verdict was already written in the faces around the table. Then came the sound of a chair scraping violently against the floor. Anna shot up, her face flushed red with fury. "I cannot believe you just did that," she hissed. "You humiliated him in front of everyone." "He humiliated himself," Jack said quietly. "I just presented the evidence." "Apologize to him," she demanded. Right now, or we're done. There it was, the ultimatum. The breaking point disguised as righteousness. The room waited for Jack's reply. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the woman he loved, but the stranger who'd just chosen pride over partnership. He smiled, small, sad, final, and said nothing. Then, without a word, he stood, picked up his glass, and walked into the kitchen. The candlelight flickered across the table where Leo sat crumbling, and Anna trembled with anger she didn't understand. The guests sat frozen, witnesses to a quiet execution. And in that moment, Jack's silence became the loudest thing in the room. The case was closed. Before that dinner, before the silence that ended everything, there had been 3 years, good ones mostly, the kind of years that make you believe in things you shouldn't, permanence, partnership, the idea that love could be reasoned into stability. Jack met Anna at a charity gala for the local legal aid office. She wasn't a lawyer yet. She was a paralegal, ambitious, radiant, still burning with the optimism of someone who hadn't yet been betrayed by the systems she worked in. He remembered the way she laughed that night, unafraid to contradict him on case law and ethics in front of people twice her age. That boldness pulled him in. Not her beauty, not entirely, but the confidence that came with it. Jack was a man of order. Schedules, contracts, clear lines of responsibility. He'd spent his whole life mastering the art of containment, of emotions, of chaos, of uncertainty. Anna, on the other hand, was movement. She lived like music that refused to resolve its final chord. She'd talk about passion and purpose while he'd talk about structure and discipline. And somehow, for a while, those two things seemed to fit. They moved in together after a year. The house became their shared project. Every wall, every lamp, every dinner recipe was a negotiation between their worlds. Jack bought her bookshelves for her endless stack of novels and casebooks. She bought him plants to soften the edges of his neatness. It worked, or it looked like it did. In the quiet of those early mornings, he'd watch her study at the kitchen counter. She'd be in his shirt, hair tied up, muttering lines of legal theory to herself while sipping coffee she never finished. There was something beautiful about her focus, the way she inhabited her dreams. He admired that, maybe even envied it. But over time, admiration became dependency. Anna had a way of drawing people in. Friends, classmates, strangers at the cafe. She was magnetic and she didn't filter who got too close. One of those people was Leo. He'd been around since her university days, the creative soul who floated from project to project, always with some new story about how the world misunderstood him. At first, Jack didn't mind. He told himself it was harmless. Anna needed friends, especially ones outside his structured world. But then Leo started showing up too often. Movie nights that were supposed to be for 2 became 3. Inside jokes formed that Jack wasn't part of. When he'd get home late from the office, Leo would already be there, opening bottles of wine that weren't his, sitting on Jack's couch like it was his living room. Jack didn't say anything, not yet. He believed in restraint, in picking your battles. But restraint, when stretched too long, turns into quiet resentment. It started with small cracks. Anna would tease him in front of Leo about his routines, his lawyer brain, his inability to relax. Leo would laugh too loud, too familiar. It was the kind of laughter that wasn't about humor, but about power, about who got to define what was funny. Jack told himself it wasn't worth a scene. He had trials to win, clients to defend. But when he was alone at night, lying beside her, he'd feel the distance, invisible, growing, real. Still, he kept giving. Tuition for her law degree, a car, so she wouldn't have to rely on rides from friends. A quiet kind of faith that maybe, once she graduated, things would settle. He told himself that people grow into loyalty, that love was something you built like a case, piece by piece, with enough logic and patience. But love isn't a contract, and people aren't clauses you can enforce. The truth is, Jack wasn't blind. He saw how her eyes lit up when Leo talked about his art, how she defended him when Jack hinted that Leo was a leech, how she softened whenever Leo failed, as if his weakness made her feel strong. He saw it, and he swallowed it. Because every man who's ever loved a woman beyond reason knows that the first lie he tells himself is always the same. It's not what it looks like. 3 years of shared rent, shared laughter, shared futures. built on the unspoken rule that Jack would keep holding everything together while Anna kept testing how far she could stretch him. Then came the invitation. A dinner to celebrate his victory. A simple act of pride. He'd even told Anna to invite her friends, thinking maybe it was time to bridge the gap between her world and his. And that's how Leo found himself at the table that night. The parasite back in the house Jack paid for, drinking the wine Jack bought, staring across the table at the man whose life he mocked. 3 years of love built like a cathedral. And in one night, a single crack became a collapse. Jack didn't know it then, but the dinner wasn't the explosion. It was the quiet detonation of everything he'd been holding in. The truth had been building for years. It just needed witnesses. There's a particular kind of man who thrives in the spaces between other people's relationships. He never builds anything himself, because construction requires patience, accountability, structure. Instead, he drifts, finding warmth in the homes others have already made, finding meaning in the chaos he stirs up. Leo was that kind of man. He wasn't evil. That's the mistake people make when they talk about men like him. Evil requires intent, a deliberate desire to cause harm. Leo didn't think that far ahead. He was simply selfish, a parasite who mistook his hunger for authenticity. He lived in a world where failure was a form of rebellion. He talked about rejecting the system while borrowing money from everyone who still had to live inside it. He called himself an artist, though no one could quite say what his art was. He had a talent for words, though, not in the disciplined way Jack did, but in the way con men do. He knew how to speak in loops, how to make irresponsibility sound romantic, how to make the people around him feel like their stability was the real problem. Anna was drawn to that. She had always been disciplined, ambitious, meticulous, but also restless. Somewhere inside her, there was a quiet resentment of the very structure she'd built her life around. Jack represented everything she thought she wanted: security, intellect, progress. But Leo represented what she feared she'd lost: spontaneity, wildness, the illusion of freedom. He played his role perfectly. The best friend, the emotional confidant, the one who understood her when Jack was too tired or too practical. He didn't seduce her with touch, not yet. He seduced her with sympathy. He'd say things like, "You've changed since you met him. You used to talk about writing, remember? About traveling? Or, you don't laugh like you used to." He framed her maturity as decay, her growth as loss, and she believed him, because every human being wants to be reminded of the version of themselves that felt infinite. Jack, of course, saw the shift, not in words, but in tone, in absence, in energy. She started dressing differently, staying out later, spending weekends studying with Leo's group of creative friends. When he asked how her work was going, she'd say, "You wouldn't get it. You live in your head too much." He didn't fight back. Not yet. He thought reason would win. He thought if he gave her space, she'd find her way back. But reason doesn't win against chaos. It only survives it, and Leo thrived in that chaos. He began to use Jack's restraint against him. "You know," Leo said one night when Jack came home early and found him there, "you're lucky, man. Most guys wouldn't let their girlfriend's best friend hang around this much." Jack didn't reply. He didn't need to. He knew what Leo was doing. Testing limits. Searching for the line he could cross without consequence. When Jack offered him a drink, Leo smirked. "You sure you want to waste your good whiskey on a broke artist?" "It's not wasted," Jack said. "Every parasite needs to be fed before it can be studied." For the first time, Leo didn't have a clever answer, but that didn't stop him. Parasites don't retreat because you recognize them. They just burrow deeper. In a way, Leo wasn't just manipulating Anna. He was studying her too. He knew her guilt, her hunger for validation, her fear of becoming predictable. He used those things like tools. He made her feel like rebellion was a virtue, like disloyalty was authenticity. And the worst part? She thanked him for it. The psychology of it all fascinated Jack, even as it destroyed him. As a lawyer, he'd seen emotional dependency before, in clients trapped in toxic marriages, in witnesses manipulated by charmers. He could spot the signs, the gradual erosion of accountability, the emotional gaslighting, the illusion of moral superiority that abusers wear like perfume. But this time, he wasn't the observer. He was the subject. Leo's genius, if you could call it that, was how he turned Anna's compassion against her. Whenever Jack confronted the disrespect, Leo would play the victim. Man, I didn't mean it like that. You're just so intense all the time. I was joking. Then he'd turn to Anna, wounded, and say, "See? He hates me. He's trying to control you." And she'd defend him, every time. That was when Jack realized something fundamental. Love doesn't blind you. Loyalty does. You see everything, but you choose to excuse it. Because admitting the truth would mean admitting you've been complicit in your own undoing. For 3 years, Leo fed off their relationship, emotionally, financially, psychologically. He drained the life that Jack built and repackaged it as connection. Jack could have stopped it sooner. He could have ended it before it festered, but part of him wanted to see how far it would go, not out of cruelty, out of curiosity. Because every parasite, no matter how clever, eventually forgets that it needs the host to survive. And by the time of that dinner, Leo had forgotten. He thought he'd infected the whole house, when in truth, he'd just marked himself for removal. That night wasn't the beginning of the end, it was the cure. Every courtroom has its ritual, the hush before the verdict, the subtle choreography of dominance and defense, the way silence can weigh more than any evidence. That dinner was no different. The table became the bench, the wine glasses were the witnesses, and Leo, smug and drunk on the sound of his own voice, had just taken the stand. Jack didn't plan it. That's the beauty of instinct. After years of dissecting lies for a living, something in him simply switched on. The calm, methodical part of his mind, the one that didn't just argue but proved, surfaced. The trigger, a single sentence. "You've got to admit, she could do way better than you." It wasn't the words, it was the smile that came after. That little self-satisfied curl that said, "You won." The air tightened. The conversations died mid-breath. Forks froze above plates. Everyone at the table felt it. That invisible shift when civility fractures and something primal takes over. Jack placed his utensils down with surgical precision. Not thrown, not slammed, placed. He folded his hands, his posture impeccable, his voice steady. "That's a bold claim, Leo," he said softly. "I'm interested in your reasoning." The way he said it wasn't casual. It was clinical, controlled. It wasn't the voice of a man being mocked. It was the voice of a man about to dissect his opponent. Leo blinked, unsure whether this was a trap or a joke. "I mean, someone more on her level, you know? A creative, someone who gets her." Jack nodded, eyes locked, the smallest smile ghosting his lips. "So, your argument is that the main qualification for being a better man is creativity." Interesting. He leaned back, the way an attorney does when inviting a witness to keep talking, to hang themselves. "Would you say you fit that description?" Leo hesitated, then puffed out his chest. "Yeah, I think I understand her better than anyone." Jack smiled fully now, not with warmth, but with precision. The kind of smile that says, "Excellent. The rope's around your neck. Perfect. Then let's examine that, shall we?" His tone was almost gentle, but there was something razor-sharp beneath it. The others at the table knew what was happening. They'd seen Jack in a courtroom before, and now Leo was the witness on trial. "Let's talk about investment," Jack began. "Anna's in her 2nd year of law school. Top tier, expensive, demanding. I'm covering her tuition in full. Not because I have to, but because I believe in her. That's not just financial, that's faith. Faith in her, in us, in our shared future." He paused. The silence was surgical. "So tell me, Leo, what have you invested in her future?" Leo's eyes darted. I've always supported her emotionally." Jack nodded slowly, his tone still calm. "Emotionally, of course. And financially?" Leo's jaw tightened. "Let's be specific. In the past 6 months, she's lent you money 3 times for car repairs, hasn't she?" Leo flinched. Anna's hand trembled slightly beside her wine glass. "Money," Jack continued, "taken from our shared household account, which, incidentally, I'm the only one who deposits into. So, technically, I've been funding your transportation." "You're welcome." One of Jack's friends snorted, unable to hold back a laugh. Leo's face drained of color, but Jack wasn't done. He wasn't even close. He leaned forward, his voice lowering. The temperature in the room seemed to drop with it. "Let's talk about this house. The roof over Anna's head, the mortgage, the repairs, the bills, all mine. You, on the other hand, are months behind on your rent. Anna's covered for you more than once, again, with money that comes from me." He looked around the table, eyes sweeping over every silent witness. "So, to summarize, your argument is that a man who provides stability, Safety and opportunity is inferior to a man who drains her finances, insults her partner, and calls it passion. Have I got that right? No one spoke. Leo's lips parted, but no words came. His face looked like a crumbling statue, all arrogance gone, replaced by the raw awareness that he'd been cornered in front of an audience. Jack leaned back, his work done. No further questions. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint clink of a glass somewhere down the table. Then Anna stood. The chair scraped violently against the hardwood. Her eyes burned, not with shame, but with fury. "I can't believe you just did that," she spat. "You humiliated him." Jack looked at her, truly looked. Not as his partner, not as his investment, but as a stranger who had already crossed to the other side of the courtroom. "He humiliated himself," he said quietly. "I just presented the evidence." Her voice cracked. "Apologize to him, right now, or we're done." That was the final verdict, the one line that shattered whatever illusion of partnership had remained. Jack didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't even stand. He just smiled, a small, sad, irreversible smile, and said nothing, because in that moment, silence was the only closing statement he needed. The jury, the friends, the witnesses already knew the truth, and the defendant, Leo, had just sentenced himself. When love dies, it doesn't go quietly. It leaves echoes, conversations unfinished, toothbrushes still in the bathroom, shadows of routines that no longer have a purpose. But when Jack's love for Anna ended that night, it didn't fade out like a slow heartbreak. It was executed. There was a strange calm in him as he watched her storm out of the dining room, her heels striking the hardwood like gunshots. The others stayed frozen, unsure whether to speak or breathe. Leo sat slumped in his chair, the colour gone from his face, staring into the wine he hadn't earned. Jack rose without a word. He collected his plate, his glass, and walked into the kitchen. The sound of running water filled the silence behind him. When he returned, she was gone. So was Leo. He poured himself another glass of wine, and for the first time in years, he drank it alone, not as a celebration, but as a ritual. The case was closed. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the quiet glow of the fireplace, the house humming softly with the ghosts of what it had been. The air still smelled like rosemary and red wine, the scent of false peace. He replayed the evening like evidence footage. Her blush when Leo spoke, the way she flinched when he defended her, the venom in her voice when she demanded an apology for him. Every frame was another nail in the coffin. Jack wasn't angry. Not anymore. Anger implies attachment, a desire to change or punish. What he felt was cleaner, colder. A kind of detachment only people who've studied human behavior too long can achieve. He had loved her fiercely, and in that love, he'd built a foundation, a home, an education, a shared future. But love, as he'd come to understand, is also an investment contract, and she'd broken every clause that mattered. So, when she walked out that night, he didn't chase her. He let the silence do what words never could. End things permanently. For 2 weeks, she tried to undo it. The texts started angry. "You embarrassed me. You crossed the line." Then defensive. "You don't understand how it looked." Then pleading. "Can we just talk?" Jack didn't answer any of them. He read each one carefully. The way he reviewed client statements, cataloguing her emotional stages. Denial, anger, bargaining. He knew acceptance was next, but it would take her longer to reach it. Meanwhile, he began what he later called the cleanup. He moved methodically, like a surgeon removing infection. He packed her clothes, her books, her framed photos, each item a small autopsy of a life shared. There was no rage in the act, just precision. He labelled every box, taped them neatly, and stacked them in the spare room. When he changed the locks, he didn't feel cruel. He felt efficient, necessary. The home, which had felt like theirs, reverted to his. The laughter and shared routines were gone, replaced by the quiet order of a man who had reclaimed control. Still, part of him wondered if she understood what she'd actually lost, because this wasn't about jealousy. It wasn't even about Leo. It was about loyalty, the invisible thread that holds everything together. When she defended Leo in that room, she didn't just choose another man. She chose betrayal, disguised as morality. Jack knew she'd expect him to apologize, to come crawling back like every other man who couldn't stand the silence. But she had misjudged the kind of man he was. He wasn't just done emotionally, he was done contractually. So, he acted accordingly. 2 phone calls. That's all it took. The first was to the dean of admissions at her law school. Jack was a respected alumnus, a regular donor, someone whose name carried weight. In calm, professional language, he explained that the private scholarship fund he'd established for her tuition was being dissolved due to permanent personal circumstances. The dean understood. These things happened. The second call was colder. To the managing partner at his firm, Jack had used his influence to secure Anna an internship there, the kind of opportunity that could launch a legal career. He explained, again professionally, that a severe personal conflict of interest had arisen and that the offer needed to be rescinded. No anger, no vengeance, just administrative finality. He didn't do it to destroy her. He did it to make reality reflect the truth. She was no longer part of his life, his plans, or his future. The support stopped where the loyalty ended. By the end of that weekend, the logistics were complete. She no longer had a home, a scholarship, or an internship, all things that had existed because she was with him. And yet, Jack didn't celebrate. There was no satisfaction, no dark pleasure, just stillness. Because when you love someone deeply, removing them from your life isn't victory, it's surgery. You cut to save yourself, but you still bleed. Weeks later, he'd find himself sitting alone at the same dining table, the same one where it had all unraveled. The plates were gone. The laughter was gone. Only the chair she used to sit in remained. Slightly pushed back, as if she'd just stepped away. He stared at it for a long time. Then finally, he said out loud, not to anyone, but to the silence itself, "Done means done." And somehow, the room felt lighter, because endings, when done cleanly, don't echo, they dissolve. 2 weeks. That was all it took for her world to collapse. Jack saw it happening not through gossip, but through silence. The kind of silence that follows a storm. The messages had stopped. The mutual friends who once tried to mediate had gone quiet. Even the social media glow, those curated photos of coffee cups and sunsets, had vanished. He didn't check on her, but he knew. He'd seen enough lives fall apart to recognize the pattern. Chaos leaves traces. On the 15th day, she came back. It was almost poetic. Same house, same door, same air thick with unspoken things. But this time, she wasn't the woman who'd left in fury. She was smaller somehow. Her confidence eroded, her energy deflated. The doorbell rang just after dusk. Jack was in the living room reading. He didn't move at first. He just watched the feed from his security camera. Anna stood outside, fumbling with her key. The moment she realized it didn't work, that the locks had changed, her face shifted from confusion to panic. She tried again, harder, as if force could undo time. When that failed, she pressed the bell. Jack opened the door halfway, the chain still on. He didn't step closer. She looked up at him, eyes red, hair tangled, voice trembling. "Jack, we need to talk." He studied her, the same way he studied a witness whose testimony had already been disproven. Calmly, clinically, "No, Anna, we don't," her breath caught. For a moment she looked like she might argue, but the fight wasn't in her anymore. The arrogance, the moral fire that had once fueled her, gone. What was left was exhaustion. "You can't just throw away 3 years over one fight," she said, her voice cracking. Jack's tone didn't change. It wasn't a fight. It was a verdict. Her eyes widened. "A verdict?" He nodded. "You were given a choice between loyalty and delusion. You made your choice. I just accepted it." She blinked, confused. The words were too precise for her to process emotionally. "I was angry," she said. "I wasn't thinking clearly." Jack tilted his head slightly, the way he did when examining a piece of evidence that contradicted itself. "That's the thing, Anna. Anger doesn't create truth. It reveals it." She swallowed hard. "Please, Jack, we can fix this. I'll make it right. Just don't shut me out." He didn't answer. Instead, he let the silence sit, heavy and absolute. She began to fill it the way guilty people do, rambling, explaining, justifying. "It's been horrible. Leo, he's not who I thought he was. He doesn't work, he drinks all day, he blames me for everything. I thought I was choosing freedom, but I was just choosing chaos." For the first time, Jack's expression softened, not out of sympathy, but recognition. He'd known this outcome before it even began. Actions have consequences, he said quietly. She took a step closer, the chain still keeping her outside. I know, I just need time. The tuition's due next week, and the internship. Jack didn't let her finish. His voice stayed even, but colder now, like the air in an empty courtroom. The scholarship fund has been dissolved, and the internship cancelled. Conflict of interest, her lips parted. You can't do that. I already have. For a moment, she just stared at him, stunned. The reality of it hit in layers. First disbelief, then horror, then the dawning understanding that the world she had relied on no longer existed. Tears welled up. Jack, please, I don't have anyone else. He nodded slowly. You have Leo, the man who's so much better than me, remember. Her sob caught in her throat. He can't help. He has nothing. Jack almost smiled, not out of cruelty but irony. Then perhaps you finally understand what you chose. She pressed her forehead to the doorframe, her voice breaking. You don't mean this. You're not this cold, but he was. I'm not angry, Anna, he said. I'm consistent. You gave me terms. Apologize or it's over. I chose over. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her voice shrinking to a whisper. I never thought you'd actually let me go. Jack's gaze softened, but only for a heartbeat. That's the problem. You thought love was leverage. It isn't. He closed the door slowly, leaving her on the porch, framed by the dying light. Through the peephole, he watched her stand there for a long time, motionless, as though waiting for a verdict that had already been delivered. When she finally turned to leave, he didn't feel relief. He felt nothing. Inside, the house was still, clean, restored to order. He sat back down at his desk, finished his drink, and whispered to no one in particular. Case closed. Outside, the security light flicked off. Darkness reclaimed the porch, and for the first time in weeks, Jack felt the kind of quiet that wasn't lonely, just final. When people fall, it rarely happens all at once. It's not a crash, it's a slow, grinding descent, a loss of colour, a quiet unravelling. For Anna, that descent began the night the door shut in her face. At first, she believed it was temporary. Jack had always been composed, rational, maybe too rational. She thought if she gave him time, he'd come around. She even told herself that his silence was strategic, not final. But weeks passed. Time didn't soften him. It erased her. The law school sent an email. Her scholarship had been discontinued. The tone was polite, clinical, unmovable. The firm that had offered her the internship withdrew the offer, citing administrative reassessment. She called. No one picked up. Every door she knocked on had Jack's fingerprints on it, not as vengeance, but as absence. He had built her world piece by piece, and now, by simply stepping away, he had let gravity do the rest. Leo was no refuge either. The man she'd defended so fiercely that night turned out to be exactly what Jack had seen. A parasite wrapped in charisma. Without Jack's shadow to compete with, Leo's confidence curdled into bitterness. The mockery turned inward, then sideways. One night, he called her damaged goods. Another, he took her phone and read her old messages to Jack aloud, laughing at every, I love you. She left him a week later. Or maybe he left her. It didn't matter. By month's end, Anna was living in a studio apartment with a flickering ceiling light, the kind of place that smelled faintly of rain and regret. Her textbook sat unopened. Her grades slipped. She'd look in the mirror and barely recognize the person staring back. Not because she looked worse, but because she looked honest. For the first time in her life, there was no one left to blame. Meanwhile, Jack moved through his days with quiet precision. Work, gym, cases, dinner, sleep. His colleagues noted that he seemed more focused than ever, sharper, colder, as though some emotional static had been cleared. But there were nights when he'd catch himself staring at the empty chair across the dining table, the one she used to pull close without asking. A phantom habit lingered, pouring 2 glasses of wine before remembering only one was needed. He wasn't mourning her anymore. He was mourning the version of himself that had believed she wouldn't betray him. It's a strange kind of grief, the loss of faith in your own judgment. One evening, as rain whispered against the windows, Jack opened his old laptop. He hadn't touched the shared folder in months. Photos, videos, trips, laughter, evidence of another life. He watched one clip, just one. Anna laughing in the kitchen, hair messy, face unguarded, turning toward him as if the world had stopped existing outside that moment. He paused it there, her mouth half open, eyes bright, alive, a snapshot of a woman who no longer existed. For a long while, he sat still. Then he deleted the folder, not out of anger, but necessity. Closure isn't about forgetting, it's about refusing to revisit the grave. Days turned to weeks, seasons shifted. And then, one morning, a letter arrived. No envelope, no return address. Just his name, written in handwriting he hadn't seen in months. He turned it over once before opening it. Inside, a single page. Jack, I don't know what I was trying to prove that night. Maybe that I wasn't afraid of you, or of losing control, but I was wrong. You were never trying to control me. You were trying to keep me from destroying myself. You were right about Leo, about loyalty, about everything I didn't want to hear. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know that I finally understand the difference between love and pride. I hope you're well. I hope you're still the man who could make a room quiet without saying a word. Jack folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. He didn't reply. There was nothing to say that wouldn't reopen something better left closed. He went for a walk instead. The city was quieter than usual, overcast, calm, the kind of morning that feels like the world's taking a deep breath. He passed by a cafe they used to visit. For a moment, he almost stepped inside, but he didn't. He kept walking, his reflection in the glass fading as he moved past it. Freedom, he realized, doesn't always feel like joy. Sometimes it feels like silence that finally makes sense. That night, he returned home, poured a glass of wine, and sat in the same chair he'd occupied during the last argument. The memories were still there, sharp, vivid, but they no longer hurt. They were just part of the architecture of his life. He raised his glass to the empty room. To endings, he murmured, and to the lessons they leave behind. Time didn't heal Jack. It refined him. By spring, the edges of the past had dulled into something almost bearable. Not forgiveness, not nostalgia, but an understanding that some wounds don't need to close. They just need to stop bleeding. He had rebuilt his life with quiet precision, as though constructing a defense case for his own peace. The house was clean, his calendar full, his routines tight and deliberate. Work, gym, reading, sleep. Nothing spilled, nothing slipped. People noticed the change. His colleagues said he looked centered. Clients trusted his calm. He smiled more, but the smiles never reached his eyes. Not because he was broken, but because he was balanced. He'd stopped needing the highs and the lows. That was until she walked in. Her name was Elena Carter, a forensic consultant. The firm had recently partnered with. Sharp, self-contained, the kind of woman who spoke like she measured every syllable. No perfume, no pretense, just presence. Jack met her on a Thursday morning, reviewing a case file about a fraud investigation. She stood across from him at the conference table, tapping her pen against the edge of the folder. "You analyze people for a living," she said. "But do you ever analyze yourself?" It wasn't flirtation. It was observation. He liked that. "I do," Jack said without looking up. "But I find the results unreliable." She smiled faintly. "Good. Honesty's a better defense than charm." It was the first real conversation he'd had in months that didn't feel like walking on glass. Over the next few weeks, they worked together often. Their conversations stayed professional. But in the quiet between meetings, something began to hum. Not romance, not yet. Just recognition. Two people who'd seen the machinery of human failure up close, and still managed to function. One evening, as they wrapped up a late deposition, Elena noticed the faint tremor in his hand when he set down his pen. "Long day?" she asked. "Long year," he said. She didn't pry. She just nodded, understanding the weight behind a sentence like that. That night, as Jack drove home, he caught himself thinking about her, not with the intensity he once felt for Anna, but with curiosity. She didn't make him want to escape his silence. She made the silence feel less like punishment. It wasn't love. Not yet, it was permission. Weeks passed. Spring turned to summer. One afternoon, Elena stopped by his office, dropping a folder on his desk. "You forgot to sign this," she said. "Thank you." She lingered for a moment. "You know," she said, "people around here talk about you." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Do they?" She nodded. "They say you're brilliant, unshakable, and a little bit haunted." He smiled slightly. 2 out of 3 isn't bad. Her eyes held his for a moment. You can't be unshakable and haunted at the same time. Can't I? She tilted her head, studying him the way he used to study witnesses, looking for cracks that weren't there, then softly. Maybe you're still in recovery. Maybe, he admitted. And for the first time in a long while, Jack felt something shift. That night, he didn't go straight home. He walked instead, past the courthouse, past the cafe he once avoided. The air smelled of rain again, the same kind of night Anna had left. But this time it didn't sting, it just existed. He stopped at a small bookstore, bought a copy of The Stranger by Camus, and left a note inside the front cover before dropping it in the free exchange shelf by the door. The note said, "To whoever finds this, endings are not failures. They're proofs that we were real." Then he walked away. For the first time since everything fell apart, he wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He was thinking about what he might build next. And somewhere between the sound of rain and the hum of traffic, Jack realized something simple. Maybe love isn't supposed to make you feel whole. Maybe it's supposed to teach you how to survive yourself. He didn't know if Elena would ever become something more. He didn't need to. For now, the silence was no longer empty. It was peaceful. He raised his collar against the rain, stepped into the streetlight glow, and smiled. A small, private smile that didn't belong to the past anymore. Healing isn't cinematic. It doesn't arrive with a grand gesture or a cathartic cry in the rain. It arrives slowly, in the small, unnoticed rituals of rebuilding what once felt irreparably fractured. For Jack, reconstruction began not with love, but with discipline. He woke earlier, made coffee in silence, went running before sunrise. Each mile he ran was a negotiation between the man he used to be and the one he was still trying to become. At work, his precision returned, sharper, quieter. The same courtroom that once felt like a stage for vengeance had become something else, a space for truth. He had spent years defending people who blurred the line between loyalty and deceit. Only now did he realize that he'd lived that same contradiction himself. Elena noticed the difference. She'd seen men rebuild before. Most did it with arrogance or denial. Jack rebuilt with order, like he was reconstructing a structure brick by brick, testing every piece before putting it back in place. One evening, after a long day in court, they ended up at a quiet bar near the river, a place with jazz in the background and the smell of oak and whiskey in the air. Elena raised her glass. "You ever think about starting over?" Jack looked at her, considering the question like it was a deposition. "Starting over implies ending something first," she smirked. "You're a lawyer. You'd make even rebirth sound procedural," he smiled faintly. "Old habits." She leaned back. "You know what I think? I think most people don't start over. They just edit the version of themselves they can live with." Jack turned that over in his mind. "So you're saying life isn't about clean slates?" "No," she said softly. "It's about continuity with correction." It was one of those conversations that burrowed deep, not because of the words themselves, but because of who said them. That night, when he got home, he found himself staring at the dining table, the same table where Leo had once been humiliated, where Anna had made her final demand. The wood still bore a faint scratch from that night, a scar that wouldn't polish out, no matter how many times he tried. He sat down, poured a glass of wine, and whispered to the empty room, "Continuity with correction." The phrase stuck. He didn't sell the house, didn't erase her from memory. Instead, he redesigned it, moved furniture, repainted walls, filled it with new memories that didn't have her name on them. On weekends, he started volunteering at a local legal clinic, offering free consultations for people who couldn't afford representation. It wasn't charity, it was balance. For every ruthless negotiation he'd made in the firm, this was his antidote. And through it all, Eleanor drifted closer, not as a savior, not as a rebound, but as someone who respected silence. Sometimes she came over for dinner. They didn't talk about love. They talked about cases, music, philosophy. One night, as they washed dishes side by side, she asked, "Do you ever miss her?" He didn't answer immediately. He rinsed the last glass, set it down gently, and said, "No, I miss who I thought she was." Elena nodded. "That's not the same thing." He looked at her, realizing how much weight was in those 5 words. Because she was right. Grief isn't about losing people. It's about losing versions of them that only existed in your head. Weeks turned into months. The wound became a scar, visible, but no longer painful to touch. Then, one rainy afternoon, he found a letter in his mailbox. No return address. The handwriting was familiar. It was from Anna. He hesitated before opening it. The paper smelled faintly of lavender, the same perfume she used to wear. Inside, only 3 sentences. You were right, about everything. I hope one day you'll remember me with kindness. Anna. He folded it once, placed it in his desk drawer and closed it gently. No anger, no satisfaction, just closure. That night, he invited Eleanor over for dinner. Nothing fancy. Pasta, wine, soft music. After they ate, she noticed the rain tapping against the window and said, "You know, it always rains when we talk about real things." Jack laughed quietly. "Maybe it's a sign." She raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" He met her gaze, steady, grounded. That some storms don't destroy, they clean. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, and in that stillness, Jack realized he was finally done remembering and had begun living. When she left that night, she paused at the door and looked at him for a moment longer than usual. "Continuity with correction," she said. He nodded. "Exactly." As the door closed, he stood there, hands in his pockets, rain still whispering outside, and smiled to himself. The reconstruction was complete. Not perfect, not permanent, but real. And maybe, in the quiet logic of his heart, that was enough. They say time heals all wounds, but Jack had learned that time doesn't heal. It reveals. It reveals who you were when everything fell apart, and who you became when there was no one left to applaud your recovery. Months passed since Anna's letter. The ink had faded a little, but the memory hadn't. He didn't reread it often. He didn't need to. Its message wasn't an apology. It was a confirmation that the past was finally over. Jack wasn't interested in revenge or vindication anymore. He was interested in redemption, not hers, but his own. Every morning he walked the same route to the courthouse, same streetlights, same coffee shop, same guard who nodded at him at the entrance. But he noticed things differently now. The small laugh between 2 strangers on the corner, the barista's tired smile, the sound of church bells in the distance. Life had texture again. He had spent years defining justice as a legal concept, measurable, provable, written in the language of evidence and verdicts. But now he understood that true justice is personal. It's when you stop allowing someone else's choices to define the weight you carry. In his work, he saw it often. People who wanted closure more than victory. And every time he stood before a jury, he found himself weaving pieces of his own story into his arguments. Subtle, unspoken truths buried inside the words. Every case, he told his interns once, is about 2 sides trying to convince the world who deserves to be believed. But sometimes, the hardest person to convince is yourself. That lesson stayed with him. He'd started mentoring young lawyers, people full of ambition, untouched by heartbreak. He didn't talk about Anna. He didn't need to. But when they asked him how to survive in this profession, his answer was always the same. Don't let your pride argue longer than your peace can afford. One evening, after finishing late at the firm, Jack found himself walking toward the river, the same one he and Elena had visited months before. The city lights shimmered on the water like fragments of old dreams, floating and breaking against the current. He leaned against the railing, hands in pockets, and let his thoughts drift. Anna, Leo, the trial that wasn't in a courtroom but in his own dining room, the verdict that changed everything. He realized something then. He had never truly lost. He had simply been redirected. Some people spend years waiting for closure to come from someone else's apology, but Jack had found his in silence, in the act of not chasing, not retaliating, not rewriting the story to make himself the hero. Because real redemption doesn't look like triumph, it looks like calm. And calm for him had a name now, Eleanor. Their connection had deepened, not with passion, but with trust. No fireworks, no declarations, just 2 people who knew how fragile peace could be, and who treated it with care. One Sunday morning, they sat on his porch, coffee cups steaming, sunlight filtering through the trees. The air was quiet, except for the sound of birds and the faint hum of the world moving on without urgency. Elena broke the silence. You ever think about what would have happened if she hadn't said that? The ultimatum. Jack considered it all the time. But not because I wish it were different, because it had to happen exactly like that. She tilted her head. You think pain has purpose? He smiled faintly. Pain doesn't need purpose, but we do. The trick is finding it after the pain ends. She nodded, thoughtful. And did you? He looked at her, at the light catching in her hair, the ease in her expression, and said, I think I'm getting close. They sat there for a while, no need to fill the air with words. The kind of silence that used to feel suffocating now felt sacred. Later that day, when Elena left, Jack went inside, took a pen from his desk, and opened his leather journal, the one he hadn't touched since the night Anna left. He wrote one final entry. I once believed closure meant winning. Now I know it means walking away without bitterness. Justice is not about proving someone wrong. It's about reclaiming who you are after they tried to define you. Done doesn't mean finished. It means free. He closed the book and placed it on the shelf, beside the stranger, the same copy he'd replaced after giving the first away. Then he turned off the lights, stood by the window and looked at the city. The same skyline, the same rain in the distance, but it didn't remind him of endings anymore. It reminded him of clarity, because some storms don't destroy, they clean. And in that quiet moment, under the soft hum of the world, Jack finally understood the truth he'd spent years circling around. Forgiveness isn't something you give to the person who hurt you. It's the final gift you give yourself, so you can start living again. He took one last sip of his coffee, set it down, and whispered to no one in particular. Case closed. Then he smiled, not the smile of a man who had won, but the smile of a man who was finally free.